On the 21st of June in the year 1097, under the scorching Levantine sun, a massive Crusader army arrived beneath the walls of a city whose name would be forever seared into the history of the Middle Ages. Antioch, the ancient Christian patriarchate, the once flourishing metropolis of the Roman Empire, was now in Muslim hands, and the Crusaders were determined to reclaim it. But no one could have suspected that this siege would last 9 months and bring twists that surpass even the boldest imagination. This is the story of how a besieging army became besieged, how a traitor was found to capture a fortress, and how a Crusader army on the brink of total destruction became victorious within a single day. The roots of the story reach back to the First Crusade, which began in 1095. When Pope Urban II, in the year 1095 at the Council of Clermont, called upon Christian knights to march for the liberation of Jerusalem, perhaps even he did not imagine what an unprecedented undertaking he was initiating. The knights of Europe, Franks, Normans, Lotharingians, Provençals, and many others, set out toward the unknown on a journey whose end no one truly knew. The Crusader army that crossed through Constantinople in the year 1096 and 1097 was truly an impressive sight. Its 4 main leaders, Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, and Robert of Flanders, each arrived with their own army, and together they moved approximately 35,000 to 40,000 men, including knights, foot soldiers, and the massive throng of pilgrims. This was the largest Christian army that had ever marched eastward. But the road to the Holy Land was not easy. The Crusaders first engaged a serious opponent at Nicaea, then, on the 1st of July in the year 1097, faced the massive cavalry force of the Rum Seljuk Sultan at Dorylaeum. This latter battle was a bloody, fierce struggle, where the Crusader heavy cavalry only managed to repel the Turkish horse archers at the very last moment. After Dorylaeum, the Crusaders began their arduous crossing of Anatolia. During the hot summer months, they advanced while struggling with water shortages and supply difficulties. People and horses perished from thirst, diseases, and occasional Turkish raids. By the time they reached Cilicia in September, the army had significantly diminished, though it still retained its fighting strength. On the 21st of October in the year 1097, the Crusader army finally arrived beneath Antioch. The city they now saw before them was breathtaking, and at the same time, terrifying. Antioch's massive walls, built during Byzantine times, embraced the city for nearly 6 kilometers. More than 400 towers strengthened the walls, and the fortifications climbed up the slopes of Mount Silpius, which rose behind the city. The city's governor, Yaghisian the Emir, was an experienced soldier who had prepared for the siege months in advance. When he received word of the Crusaders' approach, he immediately took measures. He stockpiled enormous quantities of food in the city, strengthened the defenses, and expelled or murdered a significant portion of the Christian population, lest they hindered the defense from within. The Crusaders recognized at first glance that they could not take this city by conventional means. The walls were too strong for siege engines, the towers too high for scaling ladders, and the number of defenders, approximately 7,000 soldiers, was sufficient to defend effectively at every point. The Crusader leaders quickly realized they had only one option: to starve out the city. But starvation worked in both directions. The Crusader army soon had to realize that they themselves were in danger. The besiegers' camp was not complete. Due to the city's enormous size, they could not completely encircle Antioch. The St. Paul Gate and the routes leading north from the city were still open, so the Muslims could freely maintain contact with the outside world. This had catastrophic consequences for the Crusaders. Yaghisian regularly sent out cavalry units that attacked Crusader food transports and foraging parties. The besiegers' situation was worsened by the fact that the surrounding countryside soon became completely exhausted. Everything edible had been consumed in the first weeks. By December of the year 1097, the situation became desperate. The winter was early and unusually harsh in that region. The Crusaders shivered in their tents. Their sick and wounded companions died in masses, and famine began to spread through the camp. The horses died, so the knights patrolled on foot. The wailing of barefoot pilgrims echoed through the camp. The contemporary chronicler, Fulcher of Chartres, described that period thus: "Such great need prevailed among us that many ate the flesh of horses and donkeys, which was repugnant to us. The poorest cooked tree leaves and grasses for meals. The people cried and wailed night and day. But even worse things happened." Another eyewitness, the anonymous author of the Gesta Francorum, describes how people began to suspect one another, how discipline broke down, and how even knights began to desert. Among the deserters was the Byzantine general Tatikius, whom the Byzantine emperor Alexios I had sent to assist, but who simply abandoned the army in January. The strangest and most shameful desertion, however, occurred in February, when Peter of Melun himself, known as Peter the Hermit, attempted to flee from the camp. This was the man who, in 1995, even before Pope Urban II's official call, had proclaimed and led his own crusade eastward. Now, when hardships became unbearable, he wanted to escape under cover of night with his companions. But fortune did not favor them. Bohemond of Taranto's soldiers captured them and brought them back to the camp. Before the Council of Leaders, Peter the Hermit received a humiliating punishment. He had to publicly confess his cowardice and swear an oath to persevere henceforth. This event left a deep mark on the Crusaders' souls. If even such a famous preacher despaired, was there any hope at all? But in the final days of February, a turning point occurred. On the 9th and 10th of February, the Crusaders fought a desperate battle against an arriving Muslim relief army led by Ridwan, Emir of Aleppo, and Dukak, Emir of Damascus. The battle was dramatic. At first, it seemed the Crusaders would be completely surrounded and annihilated, but ultimately, Bohemond's and Raymond's cavalry repelled the attack in heroic combat. This victory breathed new life into the Crusader army. The people saw that even in the most difficult situation, they were capable of victory if they persevered. But the situation was still desperate. Food remained scarce, and no one knew how much longer they could hold out. In March, another dramatic event occurred. On the 4th of March, word came that another massive Muslim army was approaching Antioch. This time, Kerboga, Atabeg of Mosul, led a coalition that encompassed the most powerful rulers of Mesopotamia and northern Syria. This army was so large, it could have completely swept away the exhausted Crusaders. If you enjoyed this story from the world of the greatest sieges of the Crusades, then subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Many more exciting stories await us from the medieval world, and you must not miss a single moment. The Crusader leaders now desperately sought a way out of this seemingly impossible situation. And then something happened that changed the entire course of the siege. An Armenian Christian named Firuz, who was the commander of one of Antioch's towers, secretly made contact with Bohemond of Taranto. Firuz's motivations are disputed among the sources. Some say he was a sincere Christian who wanted to help his co-religionists. Others say he was resentful because Yagi Siyan, the emir, had punished him for something. Still others say he simply wanted to save his own skin, seeing that the city would fall sooner or later. But the reason was irrelevant. The fact was that he showed himself willing to hand over to the Crusaders the tower he defended. Bohemond immediately recognized the opportunity, but he was also a cunning politician. He knew this opportunity gave him power over the other leaders. Therefore, before revealing Firuz's offer, he stood before the Crusader Council and spoke thus: "My lords, we have struggled too long here beneath Antioch's walls. If someone among us could obtain the city, whether by cunning or any other means, would he not deserve to possess it?" The other leaders, especially Raymond of Toulouse, looked upon this question with suspicion. They sensed that Bohemond was planning some stratagem, but the situation was so desperate that they finally agreed. Yes, whoever could obtain Antioch could possess it. Bohemond could now negotiate freely with Firuz. The details of the agreement remained vague according to the sources, but it is certain they agreed on the night of the 3rd of June as the time for action. Firuz was on duty at the Twin Towers, and he promised to lower the Crusader soldiers down the wall. The night of the 3rd of June was unusually dark. Bohemond had previously diverted attention. He announced that part of the Crusader army would march against Kerboga, and demonstratively began moving his troops east from the city. Yaghi Sian, the emir, and his men believed the ruse and defended the walls more loosely, thinking the Crusaders were already in retreat. Around midnight, Bohemond's men, approximately 60 knights and foot soldiers, crept to the twin towers. Firouz lowered a rope ladder from the wall. According to contemporary descriptions, the climb was terrifying. The knights climbed in armor, in darkness, on a narrow rope ladder up a 20-meter wall. One wrong move, one slip, and they would all have fallen to their deaths. But fortune was with them. The first soldiers reached the top, then more and more followed. Firouz and his men helped. They opened a smaller gate, so more could enter more quickly. The infiltrated Crusaders now rushed toward the main gate to open it and admit the main forces. Meanwhile, Yaghi Sian, the emir, slept in his palace. When he was awakened with news that the Crusaders had broken into the city, at first he refused to believe it. But as more and more messengers arrived, he realized the seriousness of the situation. He quickly dressed, leapt onto his horse, and began fleeing with a few loyal soldiers through the still-open northern gate. The Crusader soldiers, meanwhile, raged through the city. The 9 months of suffering, the starvation, the freezing, the fever and disease-induced desperation now broke free. The soldiers massacred everyone in their path. Contemporary chroniclers mention thousands among the victims of the slaughter. Part of the Armenian and Greek Christian population was saved because they identified themselves in time, but only a few among the Muslims survived. By dawn, Antioch was in Crusader hands. The Crusader banners were raised on the walls, and the battle-tested warriors of the battlefields could finally rest within the walls of a real city. But the joy did not last long. Barely a few days later, on the 9th of June, Kerboga's massive army arrived and surrounded Antioch. Now the situation was completely reversed. The Crusaders, who had besieged the city for 9 months, now became the besieged themselves, and their situation was far worse than that of the previous defenders. The city's food supplies had been exhausted during the siege, the Crusaders themselves were weak from long suffering, and now a massive enemy army had surrounded them. Kerboga's army, according to estimates, numbered 50 to 60,000 men and encompassed a massive coalition of all northern Syria and Mesopotamia. The armies of various emirs and atabegs now all camped outside Antioch, and they could confidently expect the Crusaders to surrender soon. The Crusader leaders immediately convened a council. The situation seemed hopeless. Raymond of Toulouse, who had been the most cautious throughout the campaign, now suggested they negotiate with Kerboga, withdraw freely, and return to Constantinople. Others thought they should break out of the city and try to cut their way through Kerboga's army. But there were also knights who prepared for the ultimate struggle. Among these was Godfrey of Bouillon, the Knight of Knights, whose personal courage and piety were legendary. Godfrey spoke thus: "We did not come 1,800 miles to flee like cowards now. The Lord is with us, and if I must die here, then I shall die here." But meanwhile, something strange happened in the Crusader camp. During the June days, when hunger and desperation were at their peak, a Provençal monk named Peter Bartholomew began speaking of a vision. He claimed that St. Andrew the Apostle had appeared to him and told him that the Holy Lance, the lance with which Christ was wounded on the cross, was there in Antioch, hidden beneath the floor of the Cathedral of St. Peter. Most Crusader leaders were skeptical. Raymond of Toulouse, who was the most pious among them, was inclined to believe the vision. But others, such as Bohemond of Taranto and the Norman leaders, considered the whole thing witchcraft. However, the situation was so desperate that they finally allowed Peter to search. On the 14th of June, a group of men began digging in the Cathedral of St. Peter. They dug all day but found nothing. As evening approached, people began to lose faith. But then Peter Bartholomew himself jumped into the pit and soon cried out, "Behold the Holy Lance." What happened next will forever remain a mystery. Most modern historians believe that Peter had hidden a lance head in advance and now found it. Others think perhaps there really was an old lancehead there that had remained from Byzantine times, but the truth did not matter. What mattered was the effect the discovery produced. The Crusader army was completely transformed. The people who just a day before had lain weakened by hunger and disease now stood up and began singing. The knights who had been thinking of surrender now sharpened swords and prepared for battle. The discovery of the Holy Lance sparked such enthusiasm as is difficult for a modern person to imagine. The Crusader leaders now decided that on the 28th of June they would break out of the city and engage Kerboga's army. This seemed like madness. The starved, weakened Crusader army, which was perhaps only 15,000 fighters now, would face a 50,000-strong fresh enemy army. But they had no other choice. Envoys were sent to Kerboga to offer conditions. If Kerboga would engage them in open battle and defeat them, then the Crusaders would surrender. If, however, the Crusaders won, Kerboga must withdraw. Kerboga arrogantly rejected the offer. Why would he engage them when he need only wait and the Crusaders would die of starvation on their own? But the Crusaders broke out anyway. On the morning of the 28th of June, the city gates opened, and forth came a sight that surprised even Kerboga's soldiers. The Crusader army did not look like a defeated, desperate force. Raymond of Toulouse's knights carried the Holy Lance at the front, which blazed in the sunlight. The Crusader banners waved in the wind. The knights, though many of them were barefoot because they no longer had horses, held themselves erect and sang psalms. The battle that followed was one of the most inexplicable turns in the entire First Crusade. Modern historians still debate what exactly happened. The Crusader sources naturally speak of miracles. White-robed horsemen appeared in the sky, led by St. George, St. Demetrius, and other martyrs, but even Muslim sources acknowledge that something unusual happened that day. At the battle's beginning, Kerboga's army, which had enormous numerical superiority, attempted to encircle the Crusaders. But the Crusader heavy cavalry, though greatly reduced in numbers, attacked with such fury and determination that it broke through the Muslim lines. Godfrey of Bouillon personally led the assault and fought so heroically that, according to contemporary accounts, he cleaved a Muslim horseman in two with a single sword stroke. But the decisive moment came when Kerboga's army, which consisted of the troops of various emirs, began to disintegrate. Tensions between the Seljuks and Arabs had long existed, and many of them did not trust Kerboga. When they saw that the Crusaders did not flee immediately as expected, but fought heroically, panic broke out in their ranks. First, one of the Arab contingents withdrew, then another. Kerboga tried to stop his men, but in vain. The thing snowballed. As more and more units withdrew, the others panicked as well. Kerboga was finally forced to admit defeat and fled with his entire army. The Crusaders could hardly believe their eyes. What just hours before had seemed certain death suddenly became complete victory. They plundered the Muslim camp, where enormous quantities of food, gold, and weapons fell into Crusader hands. The starving soldiers could finally fill their bellies and sleep peacefully for the first time in weeks. In the weeks following the victory, Antioch came completely under Crusader control. Bohemond of Taranto, who had secured the city for himself even before the siege, now officially became Prince of Antioch. This decision ultimately led to conflict among the Crusader leaders. Particularly Raymond of Toulouse disagreed with Bohemond keeping the city, but ultimately the majority accepted the result. The Siege of Antioch and the miraculous victory became deeply etched in the memory of the Crusades. This was the moment when desperation became victory, when starving, sick soldiers became heroes, and when the seemingly impossible reversal was achieved. The discovery of the Holy Lance, whether genuine or false, sparked such enthusiasm that it carried the Crusaders through the most difficult moments. But the siege's casualties were also frightening. During the 9-month siege, more than half the Crusader army's original strength perished. Diseases, famine, battles, all claimed their victims. The Antioch massacre claimed thousands more among the Muslim population, and the Battle of the 28th of June, though it ended in Crusader victory, also caused heavy losses on both sides. The significance of the Siege of Antioch transcends military events. This was the point where the crusade nearly failed, but ultimately continued. If the Crusaders had surrendered or been annihilated at Antioch, the entire First Crusade would have failed, and Jerusalem would never have fallen into Crusader hands in the year 1099. The victory also vindicated those who believed in the divine mission of the crusade. The discovery of the Holy Lance, regardless of whether it was genuine, gave the Crusaders a strength that transcended all rational explanation. The power of faith, which could carry people through seemingly impossible obstacles, manifested itself most clearly here. If you enjoyed this exciting journey into one of the most dramatic sieges of the Crusades, then do not forget to subscribe to the channel and share it with your friends. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it, and write a comment about what was the most exciting moment for you. In the next video, we will talk about another great event from the Crusades. See you in the next video, and let us continue together the discovery of great historical adventures.